biggest challenge facing residential architecture right now is the lack of affordable housing. And when I talk affordable housing, I'm talking housing at every level of the cost spectrum, because what allows for entry-level housing to be available is that people can afford to move up into something nicer, or larger, or to purchase something. But when people can't afford to purchase, then it drives a bigger demand in the rental market, which drives up rental prices, which makes it difficult for people who are limited income to be able to afford to find something they can afford. There's also certain communities where the cost of housing relative to the average income is just a lot higher.
It sounds like, yeah, as you mentioned, it sounds like there must be a cycle, a healthy cycle for housing, and it doesn't exist anymore. Where do you think this cycle is broke, and if there is any way to fix it?
I think the housing cycle is broken because we have it's a symptom of an economy where we have less of a middle class, where we have people who can afford really nice, expensive homes, and then we have a much larger segment of society that is looking at entry-level housing or more affordable housing, and because of the the bifurcation of our economy, it's causing more pressure on the entry-level homes at the lower-level homes. So I don't think it's necessarily a change in the housing cycle. I just think our change in the demographics and our socioeconomic situation.
This is a really interesting point, because the government's trying to address the issues. I'm sitting on the other side of the ocean from London, and here, like, there are a lot of supports for people to get onto the ladder and go up the ladder in the housing. And there are different mortgages for first-time buyers, for people who are trying to change their housing from a kind of shared ownership to different size, and gain more kind of access to the different types of housing. And in the US, there's a lot of talk, especially in California, about ADUs. Do you think there is a way that the government can help, or the market should kind of change itself?
I think the market forces actually encourage people to buy to develop and build higher end, more expensive homes, because that's where there's a more guaranteed return on your investment. So in order to encourage affordable housing and increase the number of housing units available, I do think the government has a role of trying to encourage that sort of development. And it's not only that sort of development, but also relaxing some of the zoning requirements and the density requirements, and the like open space requirements, parking requirements, especially like a city like San Francisco, where there's a lot of mass transit and it's easy to get around. The parking requirements, by relaxing parking requirements, you can have a higher density, and you increase the number of units available. It's actually what is happening with the ADUs. If you're converting an unused garage or unused parking space into an ADU, you don't have to replace the parking space, because there's an acknowledgement that we don't need as much space for cars, we need more space for people.
You mentioned ADUs. Based on the Design Everest research and their demands they've been facing, because Design Everest is doing a lot of ADUs in different places in California, it shows that there's a spike in demands since January. How do you explain that?
There were some changes in the law that affects ADUs that went into effect in January, AB 68. One of the main differences is it allows ADUs in multifamily properties, which weren't allowed before. But primarily, one of the biggest differences is it allowed a second classification of ADUs called a junior ADU, which is a small ADU that is converted from existing interior space. And you can now have both a JADU, a junior ADU, and an ADU on the same property. So I would attribute part of the spike to people who already have an accessory dwelling unit on their site now have the ability to have a second one, a smaller second one. So I think many of the people who are already, either they didn't have room for the original, a larger ADU can do the junior ADU, or people who already have an ADU realize they can now have a second, smaller junior ADU. So it just opened up the possibilities. And I think that's what's driving the increase is there are more possibilities. I don't think the demand has always been there, but now there's more possible solutions, so people have more options.
How much do you think that would be effective in terms of providing housing for people in California?
I don't think it by itself is going to solve the housing crisis, the housing shortage. I think if every available property built an ADU, it's still you're talking a single unit added to individual properties. I think to solve the housing shortage, we're going to need more multifamily housing, and ADUs will definitely help. They definitely help with the financing of the financials of people who own a house, because now they have a rental property that can help cover expenses. But there is a limit to how many ADUs can be built. I believe, I don't want to throw numbers out, but I can check these numbers. But I believe in 2019 there was something like 4,726 ADUs built or permitted in Los Angeles. That sounds like a lot, 4,700 and whatever. But if you compare that to a large apartment complex, you might have 400 or 500 apartments in a large apartment complex. So, at the very most, you're doing like one or two large apartment buildings, condo buildings, high rises, or multifamily units can equal. It takes about 5 of those to equal half of all the ADUs that are being built. I think ADUs add to the supply, but I don't think they aren't the solution by themselves.
What is your advice to the customer, for the people who wants to build ADUs? Is there any benefits? You mentioned the financials, but could you expand on that?
I think the biggest advantage or the biggest benefit to the customer who is building an ADU is that they have rental income. There's a secondary benefit that people can have their family members close. Many people use an ADU as for where an elderly parent might live, or perhaps a family member who moves back home. It does provide that sort of multi-generational housing, which used to be very common. So there's social benefits and interaction benefits. I think realistically the biggest benefit most people consider when they're looking at an ADU is the financial advantage, the financial benefit. If no matter how much you might want to have a guest house in the backyard, or to have your parents live in an ADU on your same property, if you can't make it work financially, it probably isn't going to happen. So the finances seem to be the controlling issue. There's many motivations for it, including many motivations beyond just the financial, but I think that financial is the determinant factor. My first thought was the customer was the person living in the ADU. There are some housing benefits to the ADUs. There are people who prefer living in a more residential neighborhood and not in an apartment building, or they want to live closer to family members. So I think there's benefits for the people who are being provided the housing. If you're in a small 2-bedroom, let's say it's a typical 600 square foot or 700 square foot 1-bedroom ADU versus a 700 square foot apartment, with an ADU you typically have access to the sidewalk, you have access to some outdoor spaces. It feels more like you're living in a home and less like in an apartment, which is a benefit. It's attractive to many people, that especially if you used to live in your own, if you're used to have your own house or used to live in your own house, but you're downsizing, an ADU gives you an option of still feeling like you're in a residential neighborhood, not feeling like you're in a high-rise apartment building. Many people prefer living in apartments, but there's also a segment of people, of the population, who prefer living in a more residential neighborhood setting.
What do you